Big Ben brought in the new year. Few of us could have expected the year that was to follow. Remember, in 2022, we started off very much in the grip of a global pandemic. Who would have thought that another worldwide story would dominate the news agenda?
Tonight at 10, we're live in Ukraine, a country at war after a huge Russian military offensive by land, sea and air.
The prices quickly rose to their fastest rate in over 40 years, and inflation touched everything from our household bills to our wages and our hopes for the future. The global economy was already suffering from a long COVID, with hold-ups in supply chains causing headaches and higher bills for business. Countries from France to Finland faced a double blow of rising inflation and, at best, slowing growth. But a war in Europe and the sanctions that followed changed everything. And at home, Westminster struggled to provide the answer or a team sheet.
This is it, folks.
With no fewer than 3 prime ministers in less than 2 months, this year Britain's seen its fastest turnover at number 10 for nearly a century. And it was hardly quieter at number 11.
And you'll be Chancellor and Liz Truss will be Prime Minister this time next month?
Absolutely 100%. I'm not going anywhere.
Less than 24 hours after Kwasi Kwarteng insisted he was 100% safe in his job as Chancellor, he has gone. 3 weeks of turmoil on the financial markets has culminated in this, another dizzying day in politics. Jeremy Hunt is now tasked with bringing the financial turmoil under control. What can he do?
It's third year unlucky for many firms. When our business editor went to visit South Shields Beach in March, just a few weeks after Russia invaded Ukraine, he found one fish and chip shop already feeling the hit.
The war in Ukraine seems a long way away from this beach in South Shields, but the soaring price of potatoes, fish, oil, the energy to cook them is in part due to that conflict. It's causing a cost of living and a cost of doing business emergency, which has very much arrived on these shores. And the firms we work for, whose products and services we buy, are now desperate for some kind of financial lifeline.
But Simon, the energy to cook that meal is up 400%, and that's kind of really at the heart of this story, isn't it?
Yeah, the story of 2022 has definitely been energy and inflation. And we were already seeing inflation this time last year as the world economy emerged from a COVID-induced coma. You had economies coming back from a deep freeze, you had some supply chain issues, prices were beginning to rise. But then the big event, which was Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that sent the energy markets into a tailspin because Russia is an enormous exporter of oil and gas. You saw those supplies either shut off or shunned by the rest of the world who didn't want to finance the Russian war effort. Energy prices ballooned, particularly gas, went up 5-fold and then 10-fold. And that gets into everything like electricity, because you use gas to produce electricity. And it wasn't just the energy prices, things like food. Ukraine and Russia, big exporters of wheat, and something like fertilizer. A lot of people didn't see that coming. The fertilizer which other countries use to produce their food. So you saw that inflation in those areas too. And there can't be a single individual, a single government, a single business that wasn't affected by inflation and continues to be so. And for businesses, they get a double whammy because at the same time their costs are going up, as you saw in that film there, their customers' pockets are being emptied by that same inflation. You have that double whammy, which is why Richard Ord in that film there feared that his business and thousands of others might not survive.
I've seen hundreds of shops already that haven't been able to cope with the price increases, and unfortunately things are actually getting worse. Sooner we can get something sorted with the price increases, the better, or we're going to see a lot of your local fish and chip shops gone.
Since you made that film, the government has responded in the form of the energy support package. What kind of difference has that made?
I think it's made a massive difference. I think the government realised that without that, people were looking at energy bills of £5,000–6,000 a year, and that would derail the economy completely. So they had to step in. So they've been subsidising bills since then, and it's cost them tens of billions of pounds. But I don't think they felt they had any choice. And if you look around the world, other governments have done similar things. The question is, how long can they afford to keep doing that? And that rather depends on how long we see energy prices this high. And I think that's the big imponderable of next year, is where does this end?
Well, even before the war started, inflation was beginning to seep into many aspects of British life, and the Bank of England was already beginning to raise rates. And the governor, well, he was telling our economics editor that we should be restraining ourselves when it comes to pay.
What we can do is try to prevent inflation becoming more ingrained in the system.
You're trying to get into people's heads and ask them not to ask for too high pay rises.
Well,
is that what you're trying to do?
broadly, yes.
Really?
I would say that, in the sense of saying we do need to see moderation of wage rises. Now, that's painful.
An unusually blunt acknowledgement of yet another battle raging in the British economy. After a decade of stagnation, many workers, including those in the public sector, are unlikely and unwilling to allow another fall in their living standards.
A fresh wave of strike action on the railways causing huge disruption.
We understand the anger that's caused by the disruption of the stoppages, of course, but we are getting a lot of support from the public.
There isn't a bottomless pit of money to pay increased salaries. I think there's a fair offer on the table.
40,000 members of the RMT union are walking out for 4 days this week.
This year, Britain has faced its biggest set of rail strikes in 30 years. It's affected England, Scotland and Wales.
I do hope the reasons why the strike is on is being looked into already, and hopefully we should get back, because it's really exhausting.
If we're going to strike about something, then you can negotiate first and negotiate until a conclusion. If it doesn't come to anything, then strike at a time that caused the least disruption to people.
So there has been public support, hasn't there, for industrial action, but not everyone is sympathetic, and it often comes at a cost, doesn't it, Katie?
Yeah, there's a cost to the economy and also to the workers themselves, because they lose pay when they're on strike. And this dispute has been going on for months now, no obvious end in sight. The unions say rail workers just haven't had a pay rise in far too long, and the cost of living is increasing. The government and the rail industry have said they want to give a pay rise, but changes to working practices have to happen because they say COVID has presented such a big financial challenge to the railway. These days, of course, more people can work from home than in the past, so the impact on commuters is perhaps a bit less than it would have been in years gone by. But the passengers, ultimately, who do need to travel, and a lot of businesses, are the ones caught in the middle. And back in June, I went and spoke to the manager of a pub in Portsmouth about the difficult choices he's had to make.
I think we're going to be losing about 30% of our normal trade, and a lot of that is because a big part of our trade is commuters. Unfortunately, I'll have to cut back on my staffing levels, which, that's another hit for my staff.
We've been hearing, haven't we, about the impact of transport chaos on city centres here in the UK and the toll it's taking on pubs and restaurants.
What we've seen is footfall down in city centres by around 30 to 40%, but in central London and in the city in particular, it's been down as low as 50 to 60%. And that means that you've seen, on top of those cancelled Christmas parties and Christmas bookings, you've seen walk-in trade also decimated.
It's also hitting retailers too, but there's a warning for anyone tempted to skip the late Christmas shopping trip and buy online. According to the British Independent Retailers Association, if you want gifts in time for Christmas, you're going to have to go shop in person because of the ongoing strike disruption to postal services. More sectors have joined the picket lines, teachers and university lecturers. And for the first time in 106 years, the Royal College of Nursing decided to strike this year too.
But we are operationalising contingency plans. We've got a great team, Cobra team, that's doing this every day. So whether it's our military personnel that we've trained up or a surge capacity that we can actually make sure things like borders are safe and protected, and of course people's lives are not disrupted.
A lot of us are more conscious of price these days, and lots of people have started trading down, and that's caused a revolution in the bottom line for discounters.
What we're seeing is an unprecedented shift in customer behaviour, and we're seeing customers reprioritising value like never before and switching their shopping to Aldi. And we're winning shoppers from all of the traditional full-price supermarkets.
This year, we thought differently and acted accordingly. In the summer, BBC News commissioned some research looking into how inflation is affecting our behaviour. And this is what it found.
8 out of 10 people in that survey told us they were worried about cost of living pressures. That's up from 6 in 10 back in January. More than half said it was having a negative impact on their mental health. People are having to cut back. They're saying, more than half said to us that they are spending less when they do their weekly shop. They're cutting back on that. They're not only spending less on food and groceries, they're also eating less. This is the really worrying thing. More than half told us that they have skipped at least one meal to try and save money. And 4 out of 10 people say it's affecting their physical health.
This was a situation our economics editor found in a church in Usworth near Sunderland. Workers crowded round radiators to keep warm, and pensioners fearing they can't afford the most basic of foods.
Oh, butter is a luxury now for most people, I would think. Yeah. It really is.
We come to somewhere like this, which is a godsend, where we can have a hot meal, we can sit beside a nice warm radiator.
You literally buy the radiator?
That's right, yes, it's a nice warm radiator.
Yeah. What is it? So you're here because it'll save you having to...
That's right, it saves a lot from home.
Yeah.
It saves a lot of cooking at home, which costs more money. The food bill alone, it come down because we come here.
So Coletta, you are our BBC cost of living correspondent. You've been up and down the country, in and out of people's homes and their businesses. What is it that you found?
There's 2 really different groups of people that I've encountered, particularly over the last few months, that are really quite distinctive. And one is the group of people who have probably been in fuel poverty for quite some time, are potentially more used to living on a budget. Perhaps they live on benefits, perhaps they've just had a really limited income. And actually a lot of those individuals are very good at budgeting already, but have also made all the cuts that they can. So actually, when energy prices went up in September 2021, that was their first big shock that many of us across the country didn't really feel that much or were able to take it in our stride. But for a lot of those individuals, they were really hit with it more than a year ago. So this year has then been sort of, slice after slice of their income being removed. And that's been incredibly difficult for them.
It's got really bad ever since the gas went up. I'm just constantly paying gas. I'm paying triple my gas this month to the month before. Like, I've put £100 a week on, and that's just far too much. I'm buying cheaper mince, cheaper chicken.
How does it feel about the prospect of having to spend less on Lannerly? Like, how do you feel about that as a parent at the moment?
It's heartbreaking. It's absolutely heartbreaking because you want to give your child the world.
But I suppose there's a second group of people as well that have really become evident in the last few months, and that's people who are, I suppose, very overstretched financially, but are in work. So the sort of typical example of that is, 2 parents in work, but reasonable sized house, they've got a big mortgage, perhaps they've got even 2 cars, but they're on car finance for that. And that means that really as soon as those energy bills really went up in September, October of this year, they didn't have anywhere to go in terms of their finances. Loads of people suddenly becoming really conscious of their smart meter or the bills that are coming in every month or so, and thinking, what can they do to limit that use of energy in particular? For a lot of households, that's been a really good wake-up call. Let's not leave the telly on, let's not turn the lights on when we don't need them, turn radiators off.
There is information out there about ways in which you can be, let's say, more energy efficient, for example. But there are lots of organisations, aren't there, trying to help. There are charities. What are the sort of schemes that you've come across that you think have really sort of stood out for you and are really making a difference for people?
I've got your top here.
Finally, at last. We went to visit a plumber north of Manchester who does a lot of work for free. We went to visit a project in Liverpool who's teaching people how to cook on a single stove, because that's what a lot of people have in their bedsits, just one stove, or how to use a microwave really effectively. And this is a chef that's just doing this in his free time to help out extra people who really need it at the moment. A lot of individuals that can't cope. We've been to a food bank just recently who are really struggling with the amount of donations they're getting because they're not being given as much, and yet they've got sort of double the amount that they're double the amount of people that they're trying to help and service. But so many more volunteers. It's incredible to see people just giving up their own free time to make these kind of places work.
As pressure on the UK economy grew, the political landscape was changing.
Hasta la vista, baby.
Boris Johnson stood down, and after a summer of campaigning, a new leader emerged as the threat of recession began to loom.
Liz Truss becomes Prime Minister, Kwasi Kwarteng becomes Chancellor, and they go hell for leather for what they said was a growth strategy. And what was interesting was what was happening internally in the Treasury. I found out that a forecast, the numbers had been prepared by the Office of Budget Responsibility in draft form to provide the underpinning for any policies. They were dire numbers, and in any ordinary circumstance, an incoming Chancellor may have provided some pretty massive surgery to their plans. That didn't happen. Those forecasts were essentially ignored, parked, forgotten about, and they went even further in terms of tax cuts and further borrowing, and just said, well, we're not going to publish a set of forecasts.
That was really damaging, wasn't it? You know, that decision not to publish the OBR forecast, because that's the thing, isn't it, that international investors, everyone else is looking at to say, you know, is this legit? Does this make sense?
Yes, it just shows a certain discipline of having gone through the numbers and accepted a certain economic orthodoxy, the rules of the game. Now, they were explicit that they didn't like the existing rules of the economic game. They wanted to chuck them. The result was bedlam. I've been following budgets for 20 years, and you watch the screens for the impact on the currency markets, on the value of the pound, on the cost of government borrowing, and ordinarily it never happens. It's a bit of a non-event, even though you're waiting. This time, right from the off, it was an extraordinary movement in financial markets. You could see it flowing tangibly into the real economy.
And that started to really spook, you know, the guys and girls in there, and they had to step in.
With emergency intervention, doing the exact opposite of what they said that they were going to do a week before. Clear sign of a crisis, clear sign of emergency action. And at that point, you started to see the tanker turning round very slowly. And then when the Chancellor was in the US at the IMF meetings, his budget was being effectively unpicked by his Prime Minister at home. An extraordinary situation, very rare to get the Bank of England governor coming out and talking to you on camera. But he did do it for my team in Washington when he wanted to get the message across very clearly that the support that they'd put in place had to end.
We are doing everything to preserve financial stability, and you have my assurance on that. I think there is an important task now for the funds to ensure that they are done.
But now sterling's fallen in response to what you've said, that they've got 3 days. Does that complicate matters?
No, I'm afraid this has to be done for the sake of financial stability.
So over the course of a weekend, we get a new Chancellor who decides to do things really quite differently.
Plans that had been laid out just a few dozen days before, and all of them that hadn't already been legislated for were wiped off the slate. It lists all the measures and their costings, and it's basically that's kept, gone, 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 that's kept, gone, 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 gone. Right? Extraordinary stuff. We've never seen anything like that. When you see how the economic changes are like a giant wrecking ball changing everything, and it must be said, primarily individuals, households facing this unprecedented squeeze that's come directly from geopolitical instability, leading to just frankly unfathomable rises in energy bills, but then also food bills, and then also mortgage costs, all hitting at the same time, and the instant impact that's had on politics. Essentially, and then some bad calls, or some badly communicated calls, meaning a government just lasting over 40 days, all because of essentially economics. There's nothing like it, and we're not kind of through it either.
The UK is far from the only country experiencing high interest rates or borrowing costs. The economic climate is changing for everyone.
Britain is an island nation. It benefits from foreign direct investment and trade. Here's the head of the International Chamber of Commerce talking to me in November at the time of the autumn statement and pointing to the Office for Budget Responsibility's own forecasts.
I would have liked to have seen a bit more honesty, if I'm to be truthful. There was no mention of the big B word, Brexit. We are 4% poorer as a country as a result of Brexit. So that's one of the main reasons why we have a hole in our public finances. So it's not just about international issues, it's about the decisions that we've made in the past. And if we're asking millions of people and businesses to pay more taxes, I think they deserve the right to be told and acknowledged that was part of the issue as to why that's now happening. The big takeaway from me was there's no mention of trade. Trade is 60% of the UK economy. It drives and safeguards and generates thousands of jobs across every region in the economy, and there was no mention of it at all.
The Confederation of British Industry is one of a growing number calling on the government to re-examine Britain's post-Brexit trading arrangements and the visa system supporting foreign labour.
There is going to be quite a shallow recession, but the question really now facing policymakers, facing all of us, is how do we make sure it gets no worse than that? How do we make sure we come out of it at the end of the year? And that comes down to this serial British problem of business investment.
And what of energy prices and inflation? We return to our business editor, Simon Jack.
We could be here in a few months' time and inflation might be zero. And the reason it might be zero is because you're comparing these high prices to the high prices of a year ago. But that doesn't mean that extra money, people are spending on energy, hasn't been a permanent hit to their living standards. We've seen the biggest squeeze on living standards in 70 years. And even if inflation is zero in a few months' time, it won't feel like that. And a lot will depend on what happens in the Russia situation. Now, I can't myself see Vladimir Putin saying, it was a fair fight, we came off second best, we're off home and have Crimea back whilst you're at it, which is what Ukraine wants. So that standoff is going to be all important. So that's going to be the biggest issue. The other one will be what happens to global interest rates. We've seen after years of them being almost close to zero, they've gone up very quickly to try and get inflation in check. Now, when you increase interest rates from near zero to 4 or 5% in the space of 9 months, after a decade of them being low, unexpected and bad things start to happen. And I think you're going to be basically seeing major economies, perhaps even including the US, slide into recession. The UK is predicted to be in recession for most of 2023. So it's not going to be, I can't give you a massive message of goodwill for next year. It's going to be tough. But hopefully inflation will begin to come down and that will make people feel a little bit more stable, because it's been one of the greatest shocks to the system that Western Europe has seen since the Second World War.
Well, after 2 years of COVID, another huge seismic shock to the world economy was something that everyone, including the UK, wanted to avoid. But of all G7 industrialised countries, Britain is the only one with an economy that is smaller than before the pandemic started. Yes, okay, transport and fuel bills might start coming down, but food bills, those are still rising. And that means inflation is still comfortably outstripping average wage increases for both the public and the private sector. And that is a deeply uncomfortable place for businesses and homes to close out the year. 2022 was a year of difficult questions without many answers, watched on by a nation gripped by a deep cost of living crisis and shouldering the highest taxes since World War II. Debate, though, is beginning to shift from the scale of the economic problems we face to the nature of the solutions we must find.